With that, I'd like to welcome you this morning, a two-day workshop on the circular economy. We're incredibly pleased to have our delegates here in person. It's wonderful to see people face to face again. And then also a lovely audience that is joining us virtually, not only from South Africa, but Africa and in fact around the world. And I'm sure we've got many different time zones that are joining virtually this morning as well. I'd like to extend a particular warm welcome to our OECD colleagues, Rob and Fritz, that are joining us all the way from Paris. It's been marvelous to partner with you in the lead up to this two-day session and for both the CSIR government and the OECD to share relevant information for the 2 days. And we're excited with regards to the program. I think you'll see it's a full morning, 2 mornings. We've got a lot of presentations lined up, so we're going to ask our speakers to keep very strictly to their time to make sure that we can fit everything in by 1 o'clock of each morning. We welcome our online participants to also place any comments that they might have in the chat box, and during our Q&A sessions at the end of each session, we'll refer to those as well. Online, please do make sure that your mics are muted so that we don't interfere with the presenters that are presenting here this morning. I'd also like to welcome some of our other overseas but resident in South Africa delegates, Ariane from the EU delegation in South Africa, Marlies from the Netherlands Embassy, and Marco from the Finnish Embassy. It's lovely to have you with us this morning as well. So with that, I'm going to jump right into the program. We have some welcoming remarks. First of all, it says Gauta, but I'm going to ask Mamogala, since she's with us in person this morning, the Deputy Director General from the Department of Forestry, Fisheries and Environment, Mamogala, just to make a few welcoming remarks. Thank you.
Thank you, Prof. Linda. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen in the room and online. I'm from the Department of Forestry, Fisheries and the Environment. We are glad to be hosting the OECD as partners and all the other governments, the EU, Netherlands, Finnish, all the embassies. I think it's a critical time in, the cause for us for protecting the environment as South Africa. We know that we have this responsibility enshrined by our constitution to ensure that the environment is not harmful to health, but also to make sure that the decisions that we're making today, we're making sure that the future generations, we are not compromising their ability to meet the needs. So in this cause, we need to hold hands with partners. Ours, from an environment point of view, we are working on evidence-based policy making and implementation, and OECD and all the work that goes into the reports that they share, they become critical for us in terms of considering our policy direction. So even with this session, we know we've been to COP 27, there are a lot of issues impacting on the environment. The decisions that have been made. We've also embarked on a new process looking into the plastics treaty, and the considerations in that process becomes critical in terms of informing the course that the Intergovernmental Negotiating Committee would be looking into. So we are glad that you are here. Also those that are on the online, we are looking forward to the sharing of experiences and lessons. For us, it's critical, and I think we will be learning from each other in the course of these 2 days. Thank you, Program Director.
With that, then, I would like to invite our second in terms of opening remarks, Marlies from the Netherlands Embassy. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Professor Godfrey. Pleasure to be here, to see everybody in person and, of course, the people attending online. Really great to have this discussion and be part of this discussion because it's absolutely crucial that we're talking about a circular economy. So my name is Marlies ten Boer and I'm from the Netherlands Embassy. I don't know if you know my country, it's a very small one in Europe. We adopted quite an ambitious circular policy. For me, realizing the opportunity of circular economy came about actually when I looked around and I thought everything that you see here in the room, everything is made by resources provided by the earth. And it was a realization that hit me, especially thinking of last week when we hit the 8 billion people mark as the earth. So we're having now 8 billion people. And if everybody would live as we live in the Netherlands, then the earth would not be able to sustain that. So there is a really big challenge ahead of us. So the Netherlands has made an ambition to be reducing 50% of its primary resource in 2030 and by 2015 to be fully circular. So this is something, a huge challenge that we're facing as a whole society. And we think we need to address it as a whole society, not only from a government or from a scientific perspective, but from every social partners that we have. So what we did, we drafted a national agreement on circular economy. All our social partners signed a letter of intent, including municipalities, provinces, but also the Confederation of Employers and the Netherlands industry, our labor unions, to share this ambition of becoming fully circular. And they shared, made the pledge to work on 5 transition pathways. So one is the biomass and food. Another one is the plastics, which we will be talking about today, manufacturing, construction, and consumer goods. So all these partners came together to draft a joint vision and a joint transition agenda for these 5 sectors. I think that's absolutely crucial. And we recognize that the circular economy is an opportunity, both for the economy, but also for the environment and for the society. But it's also a very time-consuming and complex process. It's not something that you're going to do overnight. So it takes time, it takes a joint effort, it takes experimenting, it takes innovation, but also a social agenda. I mean, we're not having the same triple challenge as you have here in South Africa. But also for us, we recognize we need a social agenda to make sure that the whole society is on board and that we change our labor force into a labor force of the future. So this is what we've done. And we also very much recognize that a transition in the Netherlands cannot only happen in the Netherlands. I mean, we are so much connected with the whole world. Our value chains are all over the world, also touching in South Africa. So if we really want to create this circular economy, we need also to create opportunities and the conditions for an international and worldwide circular economy. So also working with other countries. So that's why I'm here in South Africa. And that's why part of my focus is also here on the circular economy. One thing that, for example, we feel is very strong is developing circular platforms where all people come together, where we can share lessons learned, where we can inspire, where we can experiment and innovate together. So this is also something that we've been developing with our partners in South Africa, including the CSIR, the African Circular Economy Network, and many others. And we are happy to announce that we'll be launching this platform at the World Circular Economy Forum in 2 weeks' time. So that's a great achievement. And we hope that it can also give a push here in South Africa to really move towards the circular economy and make sure that waste is no longer waste, but waste is the new raw material. Thank you.
And we certainly look forward to the World Circular Economy Forum in 2 weeks' time, first time to be held on the African continent. So I really do hope that the discussion is relevant and there's a lot of learning for Africa going forward. Last but by no means least, before we jump into the technical program, Rob, I'd like to welcome you up from the OECD, our partner on this workshop this morning, just to make some opening remarks as well.
This is my favorite. This is why I'm a modeler that projects outlooks to the future rather than an empirical analysis. Because the way things are, they will not stay the way they are. The future is different than the past, and we need to keep that in mind. Circular economy, a broad concept. We're about closing resource loops, which is some people tend to define circular economy only as closing resource loops. But it's also about slowing resource loops, eco-design, increased repair, durable design. And it's also about narrowing resource loops, increased resource efficiency and behavioral changes. So here's the story I just told you. We have a doubling of materials use with a large increase potentially from economic growth, but we have structural change, the servitization of the economy that lowers materials use below what it would have been without that. And there's technology change, and the technology change is basically about we're getting better at doing what we do. We're getting better at, we have labor productivity increases, etc. So we can add more and more value to the same resources that we use and have a higher GDP without increasing materials use. The story is, of course, different across the different countries. We have much faster growth in the BRICS countries, so that's Brazil, Russia, India, Indonesia, China, and South Africa. And we see there a more rapid increase than in OECD countries, which is not surprising given the development state of these economies. And the idea here is that in the rest of the world, you start off from a low base and you're growing more rapidly. And then the thing we have to keep in mind, it's all about the environmental consequences, right? This is why we do this. Yes, it's also about resource security, etc. But if we could do this in a sustainable manner, it doesn't really matter whether we use resources or not. If we have the resources and if we wouldn't pollute the environment. But if you look at zinc, for example, zinc leads to a number of environmental consequences, not least acidification. And this is primary zinc. But if you would switch to recycled zinc, the environmental impacts would be much smaller. Even starker for nickel. If we have nickel, primary nickel is very polluting on a range of different environmental problems. If we go to the secondary, it basically fades away to almost zero. So this switch from primary to secondary materials, so from virgin sourced materials directly coming from extraction and mining towards materials that we get as recycled from our waste streams, that is the way to reduce environmental footprints. And with that, I thank you.
So with that, I'd like to welcome Ariane Lebat from the EU delegation to South Africa, who is going to be our moderator and chair.
It's my great pleasure to welcome Gauta. From the EU, we are extremely happy to work very often with Gauta. We're together in the Global Circular Economy and Resource Efficiency Alliance. We're together in the Africa Circular Economy Alliance. So we very much look forward to Gauta's presentation.
Thank you very much, Ariana. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. And thanks a lot to all the strategic partners who are here. Eventually have the session taking place both in person as well as virtually through the other means. It's a presentation on our experience in South Africa as far as circular economy implementation is concerned. This is history to say, building on the introductory remarks by DDG, the issue of sustainable development as part of environment discussions are quite key. So hence the SDG 12 on responsible production, consumption and production is coming from sustainable consumption and production. So it's true that things are changing as indicated by the previous speaker, but largely to say our environment is changing. Gone are the days where we were looking at the traditional and conventional linear economy, the take, make, and dispose. But we need to rethink with changing times and the changing environment, how do we adapt? So hence, SDG 12 being quite of one of the key response measures around sustainable consumption and production, circular economy, cleaner production, among other areas. The adoption of circular economy in South Africa, the issue of sustainable development also still key, as you can see, but also in line with the theme for today's session, to say the economy, environment, as well as the community are all important parts of our sustainable development. Hence, the balance that we need to take into consideration and strive for in our transition to circular economy. So the knowledge that significant economic as well as environmental benefits are there, and those can accrue to the countries that are implementing circular economy are some of the drivers that led us to be where we are. I've mentioned circular economy implementation, cleaner production linked to our SDGs, but also key is industrial efficiency, reuse, as well as the method for collection, sorting, and reprocessing, which largely says our real players or stakeholders goes beyond government, private sector, to include communities in terms of either informal waste pickers or the households in terms of separation of waste at source, as those are contributors to the material that eventually finds itself in this loop for transitioning and alignment to circular economy, which can be in terms of the redesigning of the products for manufacturing in a circular way, the retail involvement. So hence, when we look at the retailer involvement, also what we've done in South Africa in the implementation of extended producer responsibility, also in line with other practices, we've included the brand owner as one of the producers, in addition to importers as well as the actual manufacturers. I've mentioned the significance of the role by the household or the end users of the product, but also the recycling initiative in the recycling sector that has taken place for some time in South Africa. And key to this and linked to the issue of the strong potential to innovate and improving socioeconomic conditions is the fact that the awareness raising as well as the actual recycling initiatives dates back to a number of significant initiatives, such as the Collect a Can, where we're saying there is value in collecting material and reusing them, but coupling that with strong awareness campaign, such as we're using currently, where we have the mascot for our Good Green Deeds, which is largely initiatives that are aimed at collection of materials for contribution to circular economy. Key government initiatives include legislation and strategies that are enabling circular economy implementation in line with respective mandates for the different institutions in government. And the National Waste Management Strategy 2020 that was adopted by Cabinet in 2020 and gazetted for implementation beginning of 2021. It then details a set of interventions and initiatives for implementation to enable circular economy. But key also to it is that there are implementers who are different institutions in the country, private sector, academia, research institutions, industry, household, civil society. So the list involves pretty much everyone you can think of in indicating South Africa's commitment to circular economy. Why? Because the strategy has three key pillars, which is one, waste minimization, two, sustainable and efficient waste services, largely because of the role of municipalities in waste collection, as well as providing waste services in line with their constitutional mandate. But the third pillar is the compliance, awareness, and enforcement to ensure that we are implementing legislation. There are compliance enforcement measures put in place for that. But key to this is that the circular economy principle is one of the new principles that have recently been introduced in the strategy, building on our traditional polluter pays principle, which has been in our 2000 policy already, and the 2011 strategy had the waste hierarchy as one of the principles. The circular economy interventions, as I've indicated earlier on, they link to our SDGs as well as the National Development Plan, which is a country plan that is all-encompassing in terms of the different ministries or agencies that are there that needs to play a role in our transitioning to a circular economy. There is also the implementation plan in the National Waste Management Strategy, as well as key interventions as highlighted earlier on. One of the key interventions include the development of circular economy initiative, circular economy action plan or roadmap, the CITRA interventions as well as partnership also led to the discussions on either roadmaps or action plans, as there are countries that are working on action plans, whereas others are working on the roadmaps. The interventions that we have also include key strategic partnerships and involvement in cooperative strategic partnerships such as the Africa Circular Economy Alliance, where there is a number of work that is taking place in terms of circular economy. It's safe to say that we have developed a market assessment report from the study as the African Circular Economy Alliance, which South Africa, Nigeria, as well as Rwanda is co-chairing. And we have identified waste streams with high potential for circularity, which include construction and demolition waste, electronic waste, packaging waste, timber and pulp, leather, anti-hygiene absorbent products, waste, as well as the waste tires, which we have been implementing for some time in the case of South Africa, but we've seen a need for alignment. The key enablers include the introduction of EPR schemes, as I've indicated, the circular economy initiatives around 2016, 2017, in partnership with the EU through the SA-EU dialogue facility. We introduced the circular economy dialogues, which also assisted in paving way in terms of where we are currently. And these involve promotion of the cleaner production demonstration projects, among other initiatives that are now in our national waste management strategy. The separation of waste at source are some of the initiatives that municipalities in South Africa have demonstrated, and the demonstrations are at various stages of progress and implementation. Support for development of circular economy projects in priority economic development areas, largely because of the link to economic activities. And this is indication of the opportunities that are there if we are to treat waste as a resource and an input material into a production process that will then create this loop for us. We have in 2017 conducted what we call the Operation Pakisa Chemicals and Waste Economy Lab, where we basically had a 5-week discussions that involve all stakeholders in the sector, looking at challenges that are facing South Africa as a sector, as well as how can we resolve those challenges. In one sitting, obviously interfacing with other stakeholders who are outside the lab itself to get information on how we can develop initiatives that contribute to the economy while diverting waste away from landfill and at the same time contributing to job creation. Again, in line with the theme for today's workshop around the socioeconomic benefits of transitioning to circular economy. Key outcomes from partnership with private sector industry is the development of the packaging guideline, which is one of the 20 initiatives in the chemicals and waste economy Pakisa. Already an initiative that was looking at us transitioning to circular economy, but an opportunity that is there if we are to think about waste differently in terms of thinking about it as a trash to dump at the landfill site, but thinking about it as a material that can input, that can be an input into a production line or process to give us available goods that can be traded with for beneficial use. Initiatives on product design and waste minimization, as well as EPR, include the 3 EPR schemes that South Africa has: one on e-waste, another one on paper and packaging, and a third one on lighting. But largely indicating the opportunities that are there from thinking about the waste differently, but also in the circularity as opposed to a linear economy, hence the transitioning, factoring in the need for transformation, designing and developing secondary materials markets for recycle with recycled content. We have other processes that are looking at different types of materials, such as plastics. We have specific regulations that deal with that, and hence our different initiatives on EPR include these as a start, but we have 3 others on batteries, waste oils, as well as pesticides that are in the pipeline. CND waste, as indicated earlier on, the opportunity that are there, as well as the alignment with the 5 big bets of the African Circular Economy Alliance, the interventions and collaboration with strategic partners, as I've mentioned, these already in my remarks, as well as the market assessment, as well as the 5 big bets for circular economy in Africa, fashion and textile as some of the key initiatives. We have strategic partnership collaboration that included UNIBDO on this, as well as other organizations on textile. This is the Circular Economy Alliance. The 5 big bets depicted differently, but more the alignment of the regional initiatives with CSIR, which is the Global Alliance on Circular Economy and Resource Efficiency, looking at, again, closing the loop situations or examples or best practices. Here, also an indication of South Africa's commitment to circular economy, participation at CSIR, the launch of CSIR at UNEA 5.1, South Africa being a member, as well as close collaboration with the 2 agencies. Second last slide, largely depicting one of the outcomes of the collaboration, to say in the previous World Circular Economy Forum, there was discussions around in Africa Focus World Circular Economy Forum, and I'm glad that in 2022 we will be witnessing Rwanda hosting the World Circular Economy Forum, and an initiative as African Circular Economy Alliance we see as an African event, largely because of the strong collaboration and partnership and transitioning to circular economy, because we saw the process of narrowing down from a number of options that were there to Rwanda 2022. Hence, they have all our support. Thank you very much.
Anton Naaman will present from CSIR. Brilliant. Over to you, Anton.
Okay, so I'll be presenting on the study that was funded through the Pro Blue Trust Fund through the World Bank on advancing circular economy in South Africa, focusing on recommendations for advancing circularity in plastic packaging and single-use plastic products. So leakage of plastic waste into the environment, as most of us know, and particularly the marine environment, is an issue of global concern. An international study by Jambek et al. Ranked South Africa 11th out of 192 countries in terms of mismanaged plastic waste entering the ocean, with a significant proportion of this waste entering the marine environment from land-based sources. A more recent local study by Verster and Baumann shows that the Jambek et al. Figures are overstated, with closer to between 15 and 40,000 tons per annum of land-based plastic reaching the ocean. However, it also highlights that the majority of total unmanaged plastic waste, estimated at around 440,000 tons per annum, remains in the terrestrial and freshwater environment. So transitioning towards a more circular plastics economy is seen as a critical intervention for addressing plastic leakage. In contrast to how the concept is often understood, the circular economy is far broader than simply being about improved waste management and recycling. It also entails keeping materials and products in circulation for as long as possible through practices such as reuse, sharing of underused assets, repairing, recycling, and remanufacturing. It's based on 3 key principles: designing out waste and pollution, closing resource loops so as to keep products and materials in use, and regenerating natural systems. The circular economy therefore emphasizes the need to rethink and reduce and to redesign products in such a way as to support circularity. It also encourages the development of innovative product and service delivery models and presents new opportunities for economic growth and job creation, while also contributing towards more sustainable resource management, reduced greenhouse gas emissions, and meeting the Sustainable Development Goals. So with funding from the Pro-Blue Trust Fund, the World Bank appointed CSIR to conduct a study to map and assess existing activities around the circular economy of plastics and other waste types in South Africa, and to support the South African government in developing a roadmap to advance the circularity of plastics. So the objectives of the assignment were to provide a comprehensive overview of current circular plastics economy initiatives and activities in South Africa, to frame the circular plastics economy in the South African context, and to inform the development of a roadmap for advancing a circular plastics economy by providing a set of recommended short, medium, and long-term interventions. Ultimately, the intended outcome is to enhance the circularity of plastics in South Africa and thereby to reduce the leakage of plastics into the environment. Important also to note that given the focus on reducing leakage, we confine the study to mainly to packaging and other single-use plastic items. So the study was structured into 2 components with a combination of both desktop reviews and extensive stakeholder engagement throughout. The first component involved a comprehensive review of existing policy, legislation, initiatives, activities, projects, investments, and role players relevant to the circular economy in South Africa, with specific reference to plastics. The aim was to map existing initiatives and provide an overview of the current state of play with regards to the circular plastics economy in South Africa. This culminated in the development of a baseline report, which was shared with stakeholders in March. Component 2 aimed to frame the circular plastics economy vision, identify barriers and opportunities for advancing a circular plastics economy, and inform the development of a roadmap for transitioning towards a circular plastics economy by providing the short, medium, and long-term interventions. The barriers, opportunities, and recommendations were captured in a draft report, which was shared with stakeholders for their input in May. Inputs and comments received were then addressed, and the final report was completed in September, and it's expected to be released shortly. It's just undergoing final formatting and layout from the World Bank side. So as part of the study, we aim to frame a vision for a circular plastics economy in South Africa, which would in turn be used as a framework for developing the recommendations. So based on a review of relevant literature, as well as engagements with key stakeholder groups, the vision formulated for the study was as follows. South Africa has a thriving, equitable, and inclusive circular plastics economy, which is driven by innovation and generates well-being for society and the environment. So associated with this vision are 6 principles for a circular plastics economy: designing out plastic items that are either problematic or unnecessary or both. All plastic products are reusable, recyclable, or compostable in the South African context. Plastics are circulated within the economy at the highest value and for as long as possible and kept out of the natural environment. Decoupling plastic production from the consumption of finite resources in favor of using recycled materials. Collaboration across the value chain. All role players are engaged and active in keeping plastic in the economy and out of the environment. And finally, there's a just transition towards the circular economy. The health, safety, and livelihoods of all role players across the value chain are respected. So definitions and clarifications for these terms are provided in the report. I won't go into all of them here, but I'll just clarify that in terms of highest value, we mean maintaining the integrity of plastic products for reuse for as long as possible, and when reuse is no longer possible, maximizing the utility of plastic materials for recycling in terms of the range of applications for which the material can be used in its next life and the potential for further recovery and recycling thereafter. So the circular economy vision and principles can be translated into a framework of 4 broad strategies for driving a circular plastics economy. namely rethink and reduce, redesign, reuse, and recycle. In addition, improved collection, of course, is critical for ensuring recovery of materials for recycling, while controlled disposal to engineered landfills will still be required for any residual waste that cannot be reduced, designed out, reused, or recycled. So the framework highlights the importance of upstream interventions, particularly around rethinking, reducing, and redesigning. It also highlights that reuse, the inner loop, is preferable to recycling from a circular economy perspective, as it involves less loss of energy and materials. It also emphasizes the need to reduce input of virgin plastic in favor of recycled inputs, as well as the need for improved collection and controlled disposal to avoid leakage of plastic to the environment. So in order to derive recommendations, we identified a wide range of challenges, opportunities, and potential solutions for advancing a circular plastics economy. Specifically, barriers, opportunities, and solutions were identified relating to each of the 4 circular economy strategies of rethink and reduce, redesign, reuse, and recycle, as well as cross-cutting issues. So this slide gives an indication of the types of barriers and challenges that were identified. I won't go into these in detail now. This is provided in the full report, but I'll focus rather on the recommendations that arose through the study for addressing these challenges and transitioning towards a circular economy. So in terms of recommendations, the study derives 48 recommendations for various role players across the value chain, along with suggested timeframes and responsibilities. So yes, it looks like a long list of recommendations, but we do try to prioritize them in terms of timeframes, separating out the more urgent actions from the longer term actions. So the broad range of required actions provides a clear indication that there is no silver bullet to address the challenge of plastic leakage, and that no single role player can bring about the required changes in isolation. Instead, system-wide interventions are required through a concerted, collaborative effort among all role players, all working towards a shared vision. The recommendations are grouped under 10 broad themes, which provide an indication of the underlying key messages. So you can see them on the slide. I'm not going to read through them. And then we also propose suggested timeframes for the required actions, as well as potential role players who could be responsible for action in each of the recommendations. But these suggested timeframes, roles, and responsibilities will require further stakeholder consultation as part of the process of developing the proposed roadmap itself. So under each of the 10 themes, there's a number of specific recommendations. The first theme is adopting a common vision and roadmap for the circular economy. The first recommendation under this theme is to identify an appropriate custodian for the circular plastics economy roadmap. Second is that all role players should adopt an agreed common vision for the circular plastics economy. Thirdly, there's a need for further research to inform the circular economy roadmap, including evidence on the overall net socioeconomic and environmental cost or benefit of transitioning to a circular economy, as well as the economic, social, and environmental impacts of specific intervention strategies. So it's worth pointing out that since this report is finalized, much of this research has now been done as part of the pathway study, which will be presented a bit later on today. So the idea is that the pathway study would inform the circular plastics economy roadmap. Next, there's a need to develop the roadmap itself, and based on the type of evidence discussed above. This roadmap should specify targets, timelines, roles, and responsibilities, indicators to measure progress, and measures to ensure accountability, monitoring, evaluation, and reporting. And then fifth, there's a need to invest in capacity and infrastructure to conduct further required R&D and testing to provide the required evidence base, including development of an accredited testing facility to test barrier properties of new materials, and the development of guidelines, capabilities, and data sets for conducting life cycle assessment studies. Secondly, in terms of creating an effective enabling environment, there's a need for government to provide a clear policy direction and create a leaner, more effective enabling environment with a focus on evidence-based, streamlined, and coherent policies aimed at sending clear signals, easing regulatory burdens, stimulating private sector investment, and unlocking innovation. There's a need to review and update the definition of waste, waste classification regulations, municipal bylaws, and EIA and licensing requirements for certain types of facilities to be more supportive of circular economy. There's a need for improved regulation and quality control of imported products and materials to ensure that imports are held to the same standards expected of local manufacturers. There's a need for evidence-based standards relating to reusability, recyclate quality, and the use of recycled content in products and packaging, and for new types of materials that may arise. And finally, a need for independent standardized testing, verification, and certification, as well as clear standardized labeling to provide assurance of verified recyclability or compostability in South African conditions, inform end-of-life management, and reduce the risk of compostable materials entering the recycling stream. In terms of this, the third theme, improved waste collection and management to ensure recovery of recyclables and elimination of leakage. There's a need to drastically improve the state of waste collection services and ensure proper disposal in fully compliant landfill sites to ensure that all recyclable materials are collected and that any remaining waste is at least collected and safely disposed in an engineered landfill. There's a need for further research regarding the feasibility of alternative models for the collection, recovery, and aggregation of source-separated waste, e.g. through separate collection, drop-offs, etc., taking into account differing local and socio-economic contexts, cost effectiveness, impacts on employment and on informal waste pickers, etc. Then there's a need to implement separation at source, as well as appropriate inclusive systems for the collection, recovery, and aggregation of source-separated recyclables of sufficient volumes and quality, taking into account the feasibility of the different models in different contexts. There's a need for close collaboration between municipalities, waste collectors, and producers and PROs to enable collection of recyclables as per the National Waste Management Strategy and to meet the EPR targets for collection and recycling. There's a need to facilitate the establishment of longer-term contracts between municipalities and private enterprises to encourage investment in material recovery facilities and other infrastructure. There's a need for measures to improve landfilling standards and increase disposal costs so as to incentivize diversion. So this could be done, for example, through licensing of landfill sites and ensuring compliance with norms and standards so as to raise landfilling standards and costs. Finally, there's a need for systems to enable tracking, recovery, and sustained circulation of materials through all sectors of the economy. In terms of the fourth theme, designing out unnecessary and problematic plastic items. There's a need for multi-stakeholder dialogue to agree on the criteria for identifying unnecessary and problematic items, building on the work of the SA Plastics Pact, and to develop a preliminary list of items to be considered for designing out. Then there's a need for research to assess the impacts of doing so. So, for example, the socio-economic and environmental impacts of phasing out unnecessary items, of alternative delivery models, and of alternative materials across their life cycles, including their ability to maintain functionality and shelf life, their recyclability or compostability in the South African context, and the existence of waste collection and treatment infrastructure. And then finally, based on the evidence provided above, we'd be able to finalize an agreed list of unnecessary and problematic items and develop an evidence-based policy approach and guidelines for addressing them. The fifth theme is driving design for circularity, which includes designing for reuse, design for recycling, and design for the inclusion of post-consumer recycled content. So there's a need for internal and collective commitments among brand owners and retailers to drive redesign. There's a need to standardize the materials used for specific applications so as to simplify communication and eliminate confusion, and to allow for a more streamlined and efficient recycling system with improved economies of scale. There's a need to expand the existing design for recycling guidelines into evidence-based design for circularity guidelines, providing guidance relating to design for reuse, designing for multiple life cycles, and designing for the inclusion of PCR content. There's a need to consider the application of eco-modulated EPR fees based on the application of design for circularity principles. Finally, both public and private sector procurement policies should specify requirements for the incorporation of design for circularity principles.
Can you keep some time for questions? Thank you.
Sorry, okay, I'll try to move a bit more quickly. There's 3 more slides, I think 4, but I'll try to move more quickly. So in terms of theme 6, scaling up research, reuse models, there's a need for research relating to these types of models and their practicality and applicability in the South African context. There's a need for support for the development and implementation of these types of initiatives, multi-stakeholder engagement to drive awareness around reuse models, and the need to consider reuse targets for certain classes of plastic packaging within the EPR regs. The 7th theme, further development of recycling capacity where required. So there's a need for funding or incentives for the development of processing technologies and infrastructure and additional recycling capacity where required. There's a need to invest in innovative solutions to enable improved quality and grading. Need for research to assess the feasibility and suitability of developing processing technologies for more difficult to recycle waste streams and more advanced forms of recycling. And then finally, in the longer term, to invest in the development of these technologies we're found to be feasible and suitable in the South African context. The 8th theme is driving demand for post-consumer recyclate. So here there's a need to invest in the development of further capacity for independent verification of post-consumer recyclate content. There's a need for an evidence-based guideline identifying suitable end markets for PCR. There's a need for all collaborators to work together to drive demand for PCR. Brand owners and retailers could specify requirements for PCR content in their products and packaging. And then where feasible, there's a need to consider mandatory phase targets for the inclusion of PCR in products and packaging within the EPR regulations. And again, there's a need for both public and private sector procurement policies to specify requirements for inclusion of PCR content. Second last slide, I promise. So regarding theme 9, improved communication, education, and behavioral change, there's a need for mandatory application of a harmonized OPR on-pack recycling label system across all products and packaging. There's a need for evidence-based awareness and education campaign. There's a need for incentives and behavioral change interventions aimed at addressing unsustainable consumption and reducing the consumption of unnecessary items, promoting design for circularity and the use of PCR content, promoting and incentivizing reuse, and encouraging participation in separation at source. And then finally, the 10th theme is promoting inclusivity and a just transition. So there's a need to ensure integration of informal collectors within collection and recovery systems through implementation of the waste picker integration guidelines and as per the requirements of the EPR regulations. There's a need to ensure inclusion of the informal sector within the circular economy more broadly, for example, by including the informal sector in decision-making and policy-making processes, and expanding the waste picker integration guidelines to cover other circular economy activities beyond waste collection. There's a need for decentralized local solutions appropriate for remote areas. And finally, there's a need for retraining and reskilling of workers to transition towards new and emerging activities and the development of transferable skills.
Hello, everybody. So William Stafford from the CSIR. I'm going to be presenting our work on plastic pathways to pollution. So the question is, can extended producer responsibility get South Africa to a circular plastics economy? So obviously, plastic pollution is a growing global problem, but there's some perhaps unique aspects to South Africa's problem. We have a large number of households which don't have waste collected, and there's a backlog in waste collection services. So about 37% of households don't have weekly waste collection services, and they sort of make their own plan, which largely involves open dumping. Some of those dumps are in fact burnt. So in addition, of course, the collected waste is currently disposed of to landfills as our preferred treatment option. But quite importantly, some of those landfills are in fact not really compliant with legislation. So they don't effectively contain that plastic in situ, and the plastic leaks and pollutes the environment. So South Africa has quite a rich policy landscape in terms of managing waste and managing waste appropriately. For example, the National Waste Management Strategy, it talks about the hierarchy, for example, how to prevent and how to dispose and treat as the last option. But despite these kind of measures, and in fact, despite a levy, for example, on plastic bags some years back, these existing measures have generally been totally ineffective in curbing of course, the ongoing problem with plastic pollution and plastics finding themselves into the environment. So to address this problem, we partnered with Pew and Oxford, who have done this global study on pathways to plastic pollution. And so the idea was to test this global model and see if it was applicable at the local scale, South Africa. And the idea is obviously to provide scientific evidence to inform decisions. And the main decision is, what should South Africa's response be to address plastic pollution? So we obviously need a system map to look at the plastic flows. And this basically shows the system map all the way from production and consumption on the left there to collection and sorting, recycling, and then at the bottom we've got both managed and mismanaged waste. So some key aspects you can see here, it's a Sankey diagram, so the widths in fact show the amount of plastic flows in this diagram. You can see that a considerable of plastic isn't collected, as mentioned. You can also see that a fair amount is recycled, but it's largely through the informal sector, which does this recycling for us. You can also see of the mixed collection, there's relatively little separation at source. So quite a lot of the plastic ends up in a mixed collection, and that gets more or less sorted and goes to landfill. Now, some of these landfills are appropriately managed and compliant, and they effectively contain plastics in situ, so it doesn't leak into the environment. But you can see almost an equal amount of landfills don't do that. So they're not compliant with legislation, and they don't contain that plastic. So the uncollected waste, which is a self-help open dump type solution, together with the managed and collected waste, which isn't appropriately managed in some of these non-compliant landfills, essentially ends up with these problems, essentially ends up with plastics leaking into the environment. And it's basically plastic pollution we're talking about in three different forms. That's pollution of terrestrial environments, the land, aquatic environments, fresh water and oceans, and of course, open burning, air pollution from open burning. So we model three different types of scenarios to address this problem. One is, of course, the business as usual scenario, which assumes that we continue doing things as we've done with no particular policies and measures in place to address plastic pollution. And this is, of course, before EPR. So the second scenario is the extended producer responsibility scenario. So that's recently come into effect. And we model that as being implemented in 2023 for the legislated 5-year period. So the EPR has legislated 5-year recycling targets, in some cases reuse and recycling targets, but for plastic and packaging, it only currently has recycling targets for a 5-year period. It's about 5% per year increase in plastics recycling for single-use plastics, and it's approximately, we estimate, about 3% per year across all the plastic types. So that's the kind of target for the 5-year period that the extended producer responsibility sets. And then to explore a more optimal solution, we explored an optimal system change. In other words, to see if we could address plastic pollution further beyond what can be achieved through EPR. We looked at an optimal system change scenario, which essentially tried to reduce plastic pollution as much as possible. So that considered essentially a trade-off because, of course, stopping plastic pollution would come at a cost. So we need to trade off the objectives of reducing plastic pollution, of course, reducing costs, also minimizing greenhouse gas emissions and increasing jobs. So we basically looked at a multi-objective trade-off situation to try come up with the optimal system change scenario for South Africa. So just currently business as usual, where are we going to end up? So this is just looking at the plastic pollution component, which ends up in the environment. So you can see there's about a 76% increase in plastic pollution going from where we are currently until 2040 over that particular time period. And that's largely as a result of ongoing plastic production and consumption in the business as usual scenario. You can also see by this graph that this plastic pollution is made up of open burning, land pollution, and aquatic pollution. So the largest component is in fact the open burning of plastic waste, the largest pollution component, followed by land pollution, and lastly aquatic pollution. So what can be achieved through EPR if we implement these? Sorry, the top one is the red, the open burning, the middle one is land pollution, and the bottom one is aquatic. Sorry, didn't label that, thank you. So same here, what can we achieve through the business as usual scenario? So through the EPR scenario. So in contrast to the business as usual on the left, we can see that implementing the EPR targets for plastics over the 5-year period can achieve a 33% reduction in plastic pollution. But you can also see that it almost essentially stabilizes the plastic pollution to the current levels because of ongoing plastic consumption and growth in the future. So it's of course only partially effective in addressing the plastic pollution problem, and more is obviously needed. So also perhaps of interest in this EPR scenario is the net cost story. So across the whole value chain of plastics, the net costs in the EPR scenario is actually reduced by about 10%. And that's largely as a result of the avoided requirement for plastic production, the avoided investment needed for plastic production. And that more or less outweighs the needed investment in recycling infrastructure. So there's actually cost savings from recyclates essentially displacing the need for virgin plastic production, as you can see on the bottom right, which is the required investment, and the top growth is the net costs in present terms over the lifespan, with the wedge showing the difference between the EPR and the BAU, the business as usual. So perhaps also of interest, looking into the future, 2040, the EPR would have, of course, reduced plastic pollution by about 33%. But interestingly, what will happen is that because of the selection of mostly the rigid recyclables, and that's, for example, the polypropylene and the PETs, it more or less enriches the problematic, the multi-layer and the multi-materials in the waste stream. So looking to the future, we're going to have less plastic pollution, but in our disposal and in our waste stream, perhaps more of these problematic multi-layers. So the main findings from the EPR is that through modeling several different scenarios, we can in fact see that we really need separation at source in order to achieve the desired recycling rates and to achieve the recycling quality that we need. So the EPR scenario reduces this plastic pollution by about 33%, but also of interest, I mentioned, it reduces greenhouse gas emissions by 14%, the net costs in present terms by 10%, and it increases job creation by 18%, largely as a result of that increase in plastics collection and recycling. But of course, as I mentioned, it's only one strategy, and to reduce plastic pollution, more is needed. So we often think about these other options to reduce plastic pollution, which are quite debated. Should we ban? Should we switch to biosolutions? Should we recycle, burn, or bury? So what we wanted to address in the system change is how do these strategies perform in terms of not only environmental plastic pollution indicator, but also the economic and social types of indicators. So how can we come up with an optimal system? And how applicable are they to materials and geographies? In other words, to South Africa. How do these strategies interact? For example, is it good to have a combination of different strategies to achieve a reduction in plastic pollution? What kind of costs and investments are required? And can they be speedily or quickly implemented? So this optimal system change I mentioned is looking at a trade-off or a sweet spot between these different objectives to try and reduce plastic pollution, but also to try and minimize the costs involved, minimize the greenhouse gas emissions, and of course, maximize jobs, which is quite an imperative for South Africa. So it's almost a sweet spot between trading off these different development objectives. So we can see the system change scenario achieves quite a remarkable 63% reduction in plastic pollution compared to the EPR of only about 33%. And that's a result of this combined strategy. So here we're combining reducing plastics demand with increasing collection and recycling, and in fact, together with increasing the safe disposal of plastics to sanitary landfill. Those are the compliant landfills which basically contain the plastics in situ. So this is a summary of what can be achieved in an optimal system change, which of course moves way beyond EPR in that it substantially includes this reduce and substitute component, and of course additionally considers the safe disposal to landfill. So compared to the business as usual, where we would have seen this kind of trajectory in plastic waste, we can get rid of a certain amount of waste through reducing, and that's both reducing plastics through elimination, but also switching to new delivery models of plastics, and of course reusing plastics, making those single-use plastics more reusable. And then substitute, we're really speaking to substituting plastics with compostable materials. Those, of course, are paper and other organic type of fibrous materials, for example, bagasse, but also the new bioplastics which are coming onto the market. But of course, they need to be tested to be sure that they are in fact compostable in South African conditions. Don't need intensive industrial composting conditions. So through reduce and substituting to the paper and bio, get rid of quite a substantial amount of plastic waste. Obviously, we care of a substantial another amount. We're still going up with quite a substantial amount going to landfill, but as mentioned in the system change, we can substantially reduce plastic pollution as a result of combining different interventions. So not just recycling, but the key message is, of course, reducing demand, substituting, and also disposing safely to landfill where it can be contained. So this is just a summary of the different scenarios that we explored. You can see from left to right, and it's looking at the different objectives: plastic pollution in green, greenhouse gas emissions in red, employment in yellow, and cost in green. And as I mentioned, the EPR has considerable reductions in plastic pollution, also again in jobs, and a reduction in costs. What's perhaps notable in the system change is that it's only in fact reduction which really helps reduce the greenhouse gas emissions substantially from plastics, and that's perhaps an interesting finding. It's because plastics greenhouse gas emissions, 89% of them have occurred before use and disposal. In other words, the resource-intensive upstream use of plastics, which in South Africa involves coal to liquids process, and then the refining of that synthetic oil to plastic polymers, and then obviously plastic production, that takes care of a large portion, 89% of the greenhouse gas emissions of plastic. So that was quite an interesting finding, but the key messages are that we need to move beyond EPR to substantially reduce plastic pollution. And if we do so, we can come to a sweet spot scenario which essentially reduces plastic pollution by about 63%, but also greenhouse gases, slightly increases employment, but also notably substantially reduces the cost. So the key recommendations, of course, that we need to move just beyond EPR, which is just a single recycling strategy. We need this combined strategy of reducing consumption, increasing collection and recycling of plastics, and making sure they're properly disposed. And we need strategic interventions, of course, to reduce the demand. That's going to be a difficult perspective, but we need this reuse, new delivery models eliminate, as well as switching to alternative materials in that aspect, reducing plastics demand. And then we need key management interventions to address our waste backlogs, so people have access to waste services. And also those waste services are performing properly, so they are compliant and the waste is disposed of where the waste can be contained in situ in landfill and it doesn't leak into the environment. So we, of course, need some collaborative approach. It's not just down to one sector to solve this plastic pollution crisis. We need a collaborative approach between all stakeholders. We need to be committed to this problem of plastic pollution and see the chance to act now, to start now. So the next steps for us in this project are to release the main findings. So the main findings of this report are going to be released on the Waste RDI roadmap, and the launch is going to be later this afternoon. So you're going to hear a bit more about that later. Our future intentions are to engage with both public and private sectors, more or less to guide South Africa's input into these legal discussions and international treaties on how we can globally tackle this plastic pollution problem and start to make commitments. We also want to engage with businesses because businesses now, of course, need to comply with EPR. They need to understand on what components of their value chain or where are the best levers or strategic actions they can address the problem of plastic pollution and meeting the EPR targets. And lastly, we want to try and roll out this type of work to other African countries, which of course facing similar developmental challenges with rapid growth and the plastic pollution problem. Thank you.
Thank you, and good morning. Yeah, so I'm Fritjof Lauminger from the OECD Environment Directorate as well, colleague of Rob. So yeah, we've we've heard about an interesting scenario of what EPR can bring towards reducing plastics and increasing plastics recycling in South Africa. I will dive a little bit more into EPR as a policy tool in itself and policy considerations that come out of some of our work. So what I will do is, it's essentially based on two different reports. I will go a little bit more into EPR fee modulation, which was already mentioned by Anton earlier, or what he called eco-modulation, and how fee modulation can be used towards improving product design. And then also have mentioned some considerations on EPR implementations in the presence of an informal sector, which may also be of interest. So yeah, what is EPR? I mean, we at the OECD, we define EPR as extended producer responsibility, which is an environmental policy approach in which a producer's responsibility is extended towards the post-consumer stage of a product's life cycle. So with that, EPR has essentially three main objectives. One is to shift the financial burden from waste management from municipalities to producers, so such to implement the polluter pays principle, and to support waste management and increase recycling rates and material recovery. There's also a third objective for EPR, which is a little less present in current EPRs, and that is to aim to incentivize design for environment, which design for environment, but essentially it's to provide incentives for producers to design products such as the end-of-life impacts of products are reduced, so design for environment. So whilst EPR has been quite successful in fulfilling the first two goals, so to implement the polluter pays principle and also lead to more material recovery, there's less evidence so far that it has instigated design for environment, and I go into these reasons a little later. But because of that, policy is moving towards a more advanced eco-modulation of EPR fees. So how is EPR implemented? I mean, EPR can be implemented either individually by producers, so producers just take on the responsibility of the end-of-life products that they put on the market. But in most cases, EPR is implemented collectively. And in that, when it's implemented collectively, producers collaborate and pay an EPR fee to a producer responsibility organization, or PRO. And that PRO is then either directing the financial flows to the local waste management facilities, or it's taking on the responsibility itself to organize the collection and the treatment or material recovery of that waste. So a question for EPR fee modulation is essentially this EPR fee and how this EPR fee is calculated. So what are producers paying for the products that they put on the market? Traditionally, this EPR fee is modulated in rather basic terms. So it's just based on the material type per weight, so per kilogram of say a plastic polymer, or per unit, so per cell phone that you put on the market or per light bulb. So now there is a policy field that looks into a more advanced modulation of these EPR fees. And the idea here is to base the EPR fee and essentially the price that producers are paying on a more detailed measurable product characteristics that better determines the product's impacts of the end of life, and thus also better instigates design for environment to move towards product designs that are more recyclable or overall have less environmental impacts. So, this advanced fee modulation, there can be different criteria that are used for advanced fee modulation, and we group them into two different categories. So the more common one is advancing end-of-life fee modulation, advanced fee modulation based on measurable end-of-life characteristics. So that's really to have a more granular representation of the costs of the end-of-life of this product. So to incorporate criteria such as recyclability, the recycling rate of the product, the presence of hazardous substances, which can also inhibit circularity of the material, or consumer awareness, so actions and activities that are being taken, such as labels to improve sorting or to improve proper disposal for the consumer. There can also be criteria on which basis the fee modulation can take place, which are not necessarily linked to the end of life, but to impacts that happen elsewhere across the life cycle. So advanced fee modulation based on recycled content to stimulate to use recycled content in products, or also to on product lifespan aspects, such as criteria for specifications for durability, repairability, or reusability of the product, which essentially leads to waste prevention. So there are different issues and considerations that link to fee modulation, and in particular advanced fee modulation. And I mean, as the word says already, advanced fee modulation adds complexity to the whole EPR system. So it makes the EPR fee calculation, the rules, more complex, and therefore it also adds complexity for all the stakeholders involved, and likely also costs. So for the government that needs to set up the system costs arise for establishing the rule book and establishing the fee modulation. But there's also additional costs for stakeholders to comply with the system, additional costs for reporting and for monitoring. Because of the additional complexity, there may also be a higher incentive to avoid EPR fees and to free riding. So there's also an additional need for enforcement to ensure compliance to the system. So overall, it leads to increased complexity. There's also a consideration for products and producers that put products on the market that are not only in one jurisdiction. So when producers produce products that are being put on the market in different jurisdictions, and those jurisdictions do not harmonize their criteria for EPR fee modulation, that may lead to mixed signals and lead in the end to insufficient incentives for producers to change their design fees. So there it's important especially for product categories that are being produced for more than just one local market, to ensure that the criteria for fee modulation are harmonized where possible. Then there's one final consideration, and that relates to the magnitude of the modulation and essentially to the incentive that you can get out of the fee modulation. And that depends also to some extent on the EPR, on the ratio of the EPR fee to the product price. So in products where the EPR fee is a relatively large share to the value of the product, they're modulating this fee can lead to a greater incentive. So those are more the less durable single-use products, such as packaging, for instance, where the EPR fee is relatively high compared to the value of the product. So there you can generate a relatively effective incentive for product design. In product categories where the EPR fee is only a very marginal share to the product value, such as, for instance, in durable books like electronics, the modulating this fee will lead to is less effective, essentially. So what are the insights that come out of some of our work on advanced fee modulation? I mean, as I said already, advanced fee modulation adds complexity to the whole system. And as such, it is more likely that more mature and established systems will have the capacity to implement this and to absorb this additional complexity. When starting up with a new EPR program, it is advisable to first start with a rather basic fee modulation that is just based on weight or quantity, or very simple criteria to ensure that the rulebook is clear, to ensure that producers can comply easily with them, and to also avoid that there's a lot of free riding from the start to the system. So it is advisable to start with basic fee modulation. And once the system is up and running, then advanced fee modulation can still be implemented at a later stage. So EPR fees can still be modulated with incorporating more granular impacts of the certain products at a later stage once the EPR system is running. As I said already, the product price ratio, the EPR fee to product price ratio is an important consideration, because that essentially drives the incentive and the design incentive that you can get out of advanced fee modulation. And for non-durable product groups, they lend themselves better to advanced fee modulation, because the design incentive can be stronger than for durable product groups, where the EPR fee is very small compared to the product price. Then lastly, it's important to remember that advanced fee modulation or eco-modulation is only one tool in a larger policy mix that can encourage resource efficiency through design for environment. So advanced fee modulation can be implemented with additional policies such as regulatory approaches, so product standards, recycled content requirements, can also be supported through green public procurements, or through just taxation of the environmental impacts that you want to phase out anyways. So this is what I've been wanting to say about fee modulation. Then now I also wanted to touch briefly on something that on EPR implementation in the context of the presence of an informal sector, which is something that is featured in our 2016 updated guidance on EPR. So that's a different OECD report that some of you may know already. So yeah, EPR implementation in emerging economies is comparatively to other economies is still a relatively new phenomenon, but there are some countries that have EPRs in place, such as India for packaging in EE, China, but also we've heard from Kokauta that South Africa has some EPR systems running. But what is obvious that EPR challenges, and thus also the motivations for emerging economies to implement EPR, may differ compared to the motivations of developed economies. So whereas developed economies may want to implement EPR to really implement a polluter price and also drive higher incentives for design for environment, in emerging economies, the motivation may also be to establish a sound material collection and waste management system, and to ensure a healthy and environmentally sound waste infrastructure. What's important to recognize is that important stakeholders such as manufacturers, municipalities, and recyclers in emerging economies may not always have sufficient capacity and to comply with the system right away. So as a result, there's more support needed to get the EPR system started. And so there may be need for heavier reliance on financial incentives, such as higher price supports for diversion credits for waste pickers or recyclers. So this is a rather complex diagram, and I'm not going to go into it in detail. But what I want to get out of this diagram is essentially two messages. One is that it's important to recognize that there is already a substantial material recovery happening through the informal sector in emerging economies. So the informal waste management sector plays an important role in emerging economies, and also already lead to a substantial amount of material collection, but also material recovery and recycling. What's also important to recognize is that the informal sector works in a complex way with the formal sector where that is in place. So it can work in parallel to the, it can work in combination to the formal sector. It can work, but it can also work in parallel. And whether it works in parallel, there's a risk that the informal sector competes and undermines formal waste sector. So it's important to coordinate and integrate the informal sector and the formal waste management system where possible. So as I said, it's important to recognize that the informal sector already performs a very useful function to society by collecting and sorting material that is of positive economic value. And I mean, there's plenty of studies that prove that the informal sector can be extremely efficient in collecting material that has value. So it provides services that are in some areas not provided by the formal sector in countries with limited waste management systems. But at the same time, it's also important to recognize that there's still quite some environmental and social challenges associated with the informal waste sector. And those are mostly linked to the downstream informal dismantling and recycling processes which pose environmental concerns. So, I mean, they can really be related to emissions of hazardous substances from poor recycling processes, relatively inefficient material recovery, but also linked to the residual waste that comes out of recycling processes which does not have any economic value to be recycled, which is often just dumped or not treated and ends up in the environment. So the policy challenge here is really to secure the positive contribution of the informal waste sector whilst mitigating environmental impacts from downstream informal waste processing. Another thing that's also important to recognize, and we've also already touched upon that, is that the informal waste sector provides livelihoods for a significant amount of people. So a significant amount of people work through the gain their daily income through the informal sector. And when EPR is introduced in a market with a strong and large informal sector, this may interfere with the livelihoods of informal waste pickers, who would then compete for valuable materials. And where they compete for valuable materials, there's a risk that the informal sector then undermines the EPR system and essentially makes the EPR system less effective, but also more costly for producers. So the challenge here is to integrate the informal waste pickers to maintain their livelihoods and step by step then work towards the formalization and professionalization to improve health standards and efficiencies of the informal waste sector also as part of an EPR. So the policy recommendations that come out of our work with regards to the informal sector, that the informal sector should be actively engaged in discussions of the development of the EPR early on. And EPR systems, or the establishment of EPR systems, should, where possible, avoid becoming involved where private value chains are likely to work well. So where there's already a business case to recover certain materials and to collect them in recovery, there may not be a need for EPR per se directly, but instead EPR implementation should address market failures and environmental externalities. So it should really focus on those waste streams that are currently not being recovered, not being connected, not being collected, not being recovered in the current economic system that we have. And those are in particular waste streams that are environmentally sensitive, such as chemical and hazardous waste, waste streams that are difficult to dismantle and lead to environmental effects when they're recycled improperly, such as e-waste, for instance, lower value materials where there's just simply no economic benefit and business case to collect and recycle them in the economy. So for instance, packaging, and in particular multi-layer packaging, so packaging that is difficult to recycle. And then also to cover waste management systems in areas that are geographically dispersed, so where in rural areas where you may need to implement collection. Right, so just again, these are two different publications where this is based on. They're both available on the OECD website, but I'm also happy to send them to you per email if you're interested in any of this work. Thank you. So this session, both me and Rob are going to talk about one of our major works that we have been working on over the past 2 to almost 3 years, I would say, Rob, right? Not only two of us, so that's a big team of 15, 20 people. But it's the Global Plastics Outlook. It's essentially two publications. I will be talking about the blue one, the first one here. Rob will be talking about the green one. And essentially what it is, it's the first comprehensive mapping of the life cycle of plastics globally. So it's got a pretty high level of granularity. It contains primary as well as secondary plastics production, disaggregated down to 14 different polymer categories and applied to various applications. So it's quite a complex modeling exercise that we've undertaken. It provides detailed insights on leakage to land, water, and air. It also contains a novel analysis of the effects of the COVID-19 pandemic on plastics use and waste generation and leakage. It has a novel empirical analysis of plastics innovation. Then, as part of the two GPO reports, we have also conducted and published a comprehensive domestic plastics policy landscape that covers plastics-related policies in more than 50 countries. And it also contains a first quantification of global costs to halt plastics leakage globally. So this describes the modeling approach. I will not go into this in detail, but essentially we've used our in-house general equilibrium model EMV linkages, which has projected the drivers of plastics use, so economic growth, global population growth, trade and driver projections that then has translated into projections for plastic use based on various polymers, but also applied to various applications. Based on the plastics use data, we are projecting plastic waste. So the amount of plastic waste that is being generated in which country, and also the end of life fate of this plastic waste. So how much is being recycled, incinerated, landfill, but also then projecting the environmental impacts of plastics use and waste. So how much of that is being leaked into the environment, into terrestrial environment, marine environment, and how it gets there. So this is just a rough overview of the modeling. Of course, in the report, there's a huge methodology section where you can read up on that. So I will touch mostly upon the key findings of the first report. And the first report is giving us an overview of plastics use, waste generation, and leakage from the past until today, 2019, essentially. So what we see is that since its invention in the 1950s, plastics use has been growing steadily and exponentially. So it's been growing over the 50 years and has now currently reached 460 megatons per year in 2019. And this growth is largely driven by population growth and higher incomes. So whilst the global financial crisis and also the COVID-19 pandemic created a little dip in plastics use, this rebounded strongly in 2021, and now we see that plastics use is again back to its or even beyond its previous level to pre-pandemic times. Just to put this a bit into context, 460 megatons or million tons is just a number, but in terms of what it actually means, this is equivalent to 45,500 Eiffel Towers in terms of waste. So a whole lot of plastics that is being used globally throughout the economy. Plastics use has increased quicker than GDP between 2009 and 2019, 40% quicker growth. Plastics is also linked to quite some global greenhouse gases emissions, and as we've already heard from our colleague William, is that much of that is linked to more the upstream to the production of plastics. But it's estimated that plastics use generates 1.8 gigatons of greenhouse gas emissions. The per capita plastic use varies quite a bit between OECD countries and non-OECD countries. For OECD countries, we estimate 156 kilograms per capita plastics use. For non-OECD countries, close to 39, close to 40 kilograms per capita plastics use. However, what you see is, and those are the more, the non-OECD countries are more the bottom in the graph. What you see is that non-OECD plastics use in non-OECD countries is also catching up. So it's growing rapidly over the past years due to also rapid economic development in those countries. So with a lot of plastic being produced and used in the economy, also comes a lot of waste that is being generated. And global plastic waste generation amounts to 350 megatons in 2019. And almost 2/3 of these waste come from applications with a lifespan of less than 5 years. So 40% of the plastic waste that is being generated comes from packaging, which is sometimes only used one single time, or at least for a very short time of a lifetime of 0.5 years. 12% comes from consumer products with an average lifetime of 3 years, and 11% comes from textiles with an average lifetime of 5 years. 37% make up other products that also contain plastics, and those are more the longer-lived plastics, so also the ones that contribute more to the plastic stock in the economy. So those are, for instance, plastics waste generated through construction, industrial machinery, transportation, or electronics. So well, I said this already. Most of the plastic waste that is being generated comes from applications with lifetimes less than 5 years. So there's a quick throughput of plastics from production to waste. What we also estimate is that the plastics life cycle currently, so what is being done with this waste, is far from circular. So only 8% of the plastics that are currently being generated as waste, only 8% of the plastic waste is currently being recycled. Much is still being landfilled, incinerated, or even leaks into the environment. And I will just walk you through a little breakdown of what this means. So here, what you see is that the plastics that we use amounts to 460 megatons. Most of that is made from fossil-based plastics. So most of that comes directly as virgin plastics from fossil-based sources. A very small but growing share is from bioplastics, and only 29 megatons of plastics used comes from secondary recycled plastics. When you look at plastic waste, for plastic waste, a large share is landfilled. So in 2019, there was 174 megatons. 67 megatons is incinerated. Only 55 megatons is currently collected for recycling. And of those 55 megatons that are currently collected for recycling, not all of them are in fact being recycled, because of that collected for recycling, you still have residues in the recycling processes, which then end up as waste again. So as we calculated, only 8% is in fact in the end fully recycled. Quite a large share, 82 megatons, is mismanaged and littered. And this mismanagement and litter of plastic waste is the one that essentially creates the environmental impacts when it leaks into the environment. 34 megatons are ending up in informal dump sites. 26 are burned in open pit burning. And then there's quite some leakage happening. In total, 22 megatons of plastic waste is what we estimate that is being leaked into the environment globally per year. That that breaks down into 13 megatons that are leaked on terrestrial environments, 6 megatons in aquatic leakage, and then also we have in the model calculated the generational leakage of microplastics, and microplastics are relatively small in terms of the amount of leakage, but high in the impact and difficult to clean up, and that we estimate is 2.7 megatons that leak into the environment. So what are the key pathways and sinks for plastics that is being leaked into the environment? The key pathway is really the rivers that transport it into the ocean. So a large share of the plastics that is being leaked into the rivers is being transported through the rivers into the oceans. Half of it is also sinking to the riverbeds and accumulate in the rivers. So there's an accumulated stock of what we estimate of plastics in the rivers and lakes that amounts to 109 megatons. But in total, the amount of waste that is being leaked into the marine environment is 1.7 megatons. And of those 1.7 megatons, those then end up in the environment are difficult to be cleaned up again. So what we estimate is that the historic plastic stock that has accumulated in the ocean already through plastic waste that is leaking into the environment amounts to 30 megatons. So how has COVID-19 disrupted or rather affected the use and generation of plastics? It's affected this in various opposing ways. So of course, because of the restrictions related to the pandemic, we have experienced globally quite a downturn in economic activity, in construction, in manufacturing, etc. So because of that, there has been a reduction in plastic use in those activities that use plastics as an input. However, at the same time, we have also seen an increase in plastics use in other sectors, and those are particularly in other sectors, particularly related to public health. So there's been an increase in plastic use due to single-use masks, for instance, personal protective equipment, also plastics used in the medical sector that were being used in hospitals. So overall, plastics for hygiene. There's also been an increasing trend to, with lockdown measures, to order food for takeout. And therefore, there's also been an increase in plastics packaging for food consumption. So this balances out a little bit the reduction in plastics use. But overall, there has still been a net decline in plastics use over the COVID-19 pandemic. But in particularly, the composition of where this plastic was generated has changed. So overall, we estimate a 2.2% decrease in plastics use in 2020. However, it's important to recognize for this, but also for plastics in general, that plastics leaked into the environment are not always the same. So the amount of plastics that are leaked into the environment is not necessarily a good proxy for its environmental impacts. What you see is that the small plastics like personal protective equipment is a very, very short-lived plastics that is sometimes masks or gloves are only being used once. And if there's a high tendency to littering, then this disperses for relatively low kilogram weight. It disperses a lot of different plastics items in the environment and the marine environment, and there, when ingested by marine mammals, etc., can lead to severe ecosystem impacts. So what are the key levers that we propose as part of this report? We propose essentially 3 levers to reduce plastics, to increase plastic circularity and reduce the environmental impacts of plastics. Number one is to increase and strengthen markets for recycled plastics. And that includes measures to increase the demand for recycled plastics, such as through recycled content standards or green procurement. It includes measures to push the supply of secondary plastics through, for instance, extended producer responsibility schemes or R&D support for recycling technologies. Eco-design and bans on hazardous substances can improve the quality of secondary feedstocks. And as well, it's important to level the playing field of pricing externalities of use of primary plastics to make secondary plastics more cost competitive. Second lever is to boost innovation for circular plastics. So to boost that plastics are being developed that are more recyclable, that are overall more circular. And reduce their environmental impacts. These include measures for circular plastics innovation, strengthen framework conditions for such innovation, price environmental externalities of primary plastics again, and strengthen policies to incentivize design for circularity, boost demand for secondary plastics, close plastics loop, and curb plastics leakage. The third lever is to scale up international cooperation. What you didn't see in the graph is, but like what is well present is that much of the plastics leakage that is happening in the more emerging economies. So that it's important to mobilize all sources of funding, including official development aid, to close this tab from plastics leakage. It's important to support effective legal frameworks to enforce disposal obligations. Upstream actions are also necessary to enhance plastic circularity and to design our plastics where it's environmentally preferable, and also to include international alignment of design approaches, product policies, and the regulation of chemical substances. This is what we've touched upon already in terms of phasing out hazardous substances in plastics. So with that, we come to we recommend a policy framework that is built on 3 pathways essentially, and those go in increasing order from basic to more advanced internalization of externalities, and also in increasing order from low to higher circular use of plastics. So as a third pathway, we recommend that domestic policy action should focus on really closing leakage. So this should be to invest in collection and disposal infrastructure, and to ban or tax frequently littered items to really avoid that plastics that is frequently leaked into the environment is collected properly. Then as a second pathway, we recommend to create incentives for recycling and sorting at source. So that is would then comprise extended producer responsibility schemes for packaging and durables, landfill and incineration taxes that divert plastics from landfilling and incineration to higher measures, deposit refund schemes that enable a separate and effective collection of certain waste streams, and pay-as-you-throw schemes that can also encourage separation at source. Then, as domestic policy further advances, there's a third pathway, and that is to restrain demand and design for circularity. So this is looking more into the upstream measures of designing plastics. So this would be ban or tax single-use plastics, remove fossil fuel subsidies, regulate hazardous substances, impose recycled content standards, and modulate extended producer responsibility fees to provide an incentive for recycling. So with that, I finish my presentation. I may just pass on to Rob right away.
So what Fritz has basically been presenting is the stock take. Where are we now, and what are the issues, and how can we find solutions for that? But we also seen that, so that one was published, I think, in spring of this year, and then the second one was only a few months later, but still we see a big change in the policy landscape. We see a breakthrough in the international coordination, international policy coordination of plastics, with an increased ambition to end plastics pollution. And there is the UNEA resolution to end plastic pollution, which is a major breakthrough, and that really brings governments together to try and find solutions. First negotiations are up, I guess, next week or in 2 weeks from now. So we'll have to see how easy those discussions are. If we've seen the recent COP on climate, I hope this one is less complex. But there seems to be a shared sense that we need to tackle plastics pollution. And this has come up fairly quickly and fairly strongly, and there's really a sense, I think, in many governments that now is the time to really start tackling this problem. More parochial for the OECD itself, we had a ministerial declaration for a resilient and healthy environment for all, in which OECD ministers all declared that they want to support the the plastics negotiations, and they want OECD to continue working on finding policy solutions for plastics pollution. We also see an increased geopolitical and economic uncertainty with supply chain disruptions, spiking commodity prices, etc. Many countries struggling with inflation recently, etc. So there's a lot going on. So the question is, in this roadmap, policy roadmap that Fritz presented, where do we start? How do we do this? And how do we get this global ambition? So the second report is about forward-looking analysis to 2060 with this big model that we have that links basically plastics use to specific production processes. So we have plastics use associated with the use of rubber and plastics products in production processes, in consumption, etc. And then that gives us the levers to figure out, like, how do you break the direct correspondence between economic activity and plastics use. So we present a number of scenarios for a baseline scenario and policy scenarios, basically to figure out how to break the chain between those two. And we also have a chapter that investigates the synergies between plastics and climate policies, which is an interesting one. I will not deal with that in this presentation, but I'm happy to follow up bilaterally if people want to know more. The bottom line there is basically that plastics policies and climate policies are both very important, and they are linked because there is a lot of greenhouse gas emissions from plastics, but don't expect climate policy to solve plastics pollution, and don't expect plastics policies to solve your climate problem. You need both, and you can't substitute one for the other. You need to harmonize them, you need to integrate them, but you need them separately. So under business as usual, we see this is the part that Fritz presented, and this is what we project for the future, which is a tripling almost of plastics use, and that is basically in all regions in the world. Unfortunately, we don't have South Africa separated here. Tomorrow we might present some results for other raw materials where we do have results for South Africa, but here in this analysis we couldn't separate South Africa. But you do see the kind of the expected picture. The most emerging economies have the highest growth rates, whereas OECD countries have high levels but lower growth rates. And developing countries come from such a low base that even if the growth rates are fairly high, the volumes by 2060 are still fairly modest. Now, plastics use, that's all plastics use. We have 14 polymers, and that includes also synthetic fibers. That's why Fritz presented, for example, textiles as a priority, and all of them increase. It's not as if we are focusing on one or two polymers that are increasing more than the others. And they do so in all applications. So Fritz already presented where some of the major applications are, and this graph, the complexity of this graph, actually, for me, this is the horrible graph to show to an audience because nobody sees anything. But if That's exactly the point. The point is all this is so complex in how it interacts. So many different polymers used in so many different applications that you need a coherent approach across everything, and you can't deal with just simply looking at one polymer and let's pick that one out. Yes, you need to look at packaging separately because there's a large amount of single-use plastics there. But construction has many different polymers used. Vehicles uses different polymers, etc. So many applications, and you basically need to tackle them all. Then plastics waste will also triple. So even though plastics use leads to a delay in waste because of the lifetime of plastics, and in construction that can be decades, we see that total plastics waste is kind of still catching up to all the plastics use that we've been having in the last decades or so, and that's why it is increasing as rapidly as plastics use. And this is global numbers, still 15% being mismanaged by 2060. That's down from 22% in, let me talk. That's down from 22% now, and the reason for that basically is economic development. If countries become richer, they have more resources to invest in proper waste management. We also see that littering rates, for example, tend to decline with income. So we see some reduction in the share of mismanaged waste, but still an increase in the volume of mismanaged waste, and therefore also in plastics leakage and plastics pollution. Then roughly half of it will still be landfilled, and this is landfilled in sanitary landfills, basically. Or maybe in the South African context, I should say, in landfills that are registered as sanitary. So we don't look at compliance issues here. We are not. We just look at the total category. But it excludes open dumps and fire burning. Then we have incineration. Incineration is on average stays the same, but incineration actually has it's really a regional story because you have a bunch of countries that rely heavily on incineration, and those tend to be the countries with not a lot of land available for landfilling. Netherlands is a typical example, have a lot of incineration with long-term contracts between municipalities and incineration facilities to incinerate municipal waste and therefore also plastic waste. Other countries have a lot of land and therefore landfilling is cheaper and they don't have any incineration at all. So the global picture is then a mixture of basically two quite extreme versions. And finally, on recycling, Fritz said 8% circularity. I think we have in the report 3 different definitions of circularity of plastics. It depends on how much is collected for recycling versus how much is actually recycled. This 9% here is recycled. I think it's 12% if you look at what is collected for recycling because of all the recycling losses. That goes up to 17%. There is current policies in many countries that boost recycling. There's also, when you have a bigger demand for plastics, there's also a bigger demand for secondary plastics. So we do see already in the baseline an increase in recycling, but not that much. It's 17% is still a quite small share. Then macroplastics tend to follow a Kuznets curve. Basically, if you're developing your economy, at first that leads to a large increase in plastics, in macroplastics per capita, but over time that declines as you become richer because you have better waste management systems, etc. Microplastics is completely the opposite. As the richer you become, the more microplastics you produce, and OECD countries need to start grappling with microplastics and policies for microplastics to deal with them because there is hardly anything at the moment going on there. What are the policy packages? Now I'm going to speed up because I think otherwise I'm running out of time before I get to my results. So we have 2 scenarios. One scenario is basically looking from the present. Let's do a little bit more. Let's think about what countries can do and then see how far we get. The other one is let's start with the premise that we want to eliminate all plastics leakage and then figure out how we get there. So we have policy packages that have something like 8 different policies that we included here, and they include plastics, packaging taxes, non-packaging taxes, eco-design, improved waste management, recycled content targets, extended producer responsibility, improved plastic waste collection, and improved litter collection. And they all meet and work together to tackle plastic pollution throughout the life cycle. So these are upstream policies as well as downstream policies, and you need them all. What happens in the baseline is you get this increase in plastics use and in plastic waste, a little bit less mismanaged waste, but still an increase also in plastic leakage. Then in this regional action scenario, so kind of more plausible scenario, it's a reduction from baseline. Williams talked about reductions, a reduction from baseline this is, but this is clearly not a reduction from current levels. This is still an increase in all plastics use, plastic waste, mismanaged plastic waste, and plastic leakage. And for plastic leakage, we basically get a stabilization of leakage levels. This is where we get with the policies that we think might be plausible, in which OECD countries have stronger action than non-OECD countries, etc. Then the third scenario, the global ambition, the one where we try to eliminate plastics pollution. We still see a reduction in plastic use, but a reduction in plastic use doesn't necessarily mean a reduction in absolute terms compared to current levels. We think that it is much cheaper in the policy mix to still keep using plastics, although a much larger share secondary plastics, but to still, so not to restrict demand completely, but actually to have an increase in demand, but have better handle on the waste management system. So we eliminate mismanaged plastic waste not to 0, but only to 6 megatons. It's still quite a lot less than in the baseline. And the reason why you can't eliminate plastics pollution completely is that not everything goes through the waste management system. There's littering, there is ghost fishing gear, there's all microplastics leakage, for example, that basically our waste handlers have no way of dealing with. So there's always something leaking to the environment. That's why the better term is not 0 plastics pollution, but minimize plastics pollution. But there's only a little bit left. But even with that little bit left, the stocks in the rivers and oceans, yes, it's going to triple if we in a baseline, but it's still going to double in our global ambition. So even under the most ambitious policies where you have basically eliminated plastics pollution, you still get a doubling of plastics in the ocean, in the rivers and oceans. And that is, of course, because you need time to reduce your plastics flows to near 0, the mismanaged plastics flows to near 0. So there's also a need for cleanup of plastics in stocks and rivers. All these different pillars contribute to this. I'm going to skip this one and look only at the global ambition, global action. So we need, if you look just at the plastic leakage, the biggest reduction actually comes from restraining demand. So even though plastics use can increase beyond 2019 levels or 2020 levels, we still see that is the biggest share in the wedge, biggest wedge in the difference between the policy scenario and the baseline. But it's all three, the different pillars are essential in reducing plastic leakage. Costs are not 0, but actually not that high. This is regional action. We see the largest costs. Costs are basically shared. There's a few countries that have very particular economies that have higher costs of reducing this, but at the global level, we're talking about something like 0.3% of GDP. This is not nothing. This is billions of dollars. This is not to say this is negligible, but it is limited. But then if we look at this global ambition scenario, you see much higher costs in non-OECD countries. And this is exactly where Fritz's story about ODA and other financing sources comes in. These additional costs in non-OECD countries will have to be somehow financed, and there will have to be an international coordination mechanism in order to achieve these ambitious reductions globally. Where eliminating leakage requires global action throughout the life cycle. We can reduce plastic flows to the environment at limited costs, but we need international financing. We still have a lot of plastics going to the ocean and going to the rivers, so we do need flanking efforts. We do need cleanup. Trade scenarios, I didn't talk about that. Trade in plastic waste has been restricted quite substantially. And this is a double-edged sword. On the one hand, it's good that you keep your materials in value in your economies. On the other hand, scale is so essential for recycling. And I heard already stories like we don't have testing facilities in South Africa, etc. If you prohibit all trade, you also prohibit a lot of recycling opportunities because a lot of them come from scaling up activities. Circular business models need scale to operate, and scale is something that trade can provide. And finally, to achieve more circular use of plastic, trade policies and environmental policies need to go hand in hand because we do need to make sure that we all work together to get this, to eliminate plastics.
So I think you can see my screen now. We are indeed entering into a negotiation process of a new global agreement on plastics. Well, actually starting on Monday. Which will be preceded by a multi-stakeholder forum on Saturday, and of course, following the climate negotiations and also in view of upcoming biodiversity negotiations, a lot of attention will also now in the coming week will be on the plastics. This has been and is still a very important element of the Circular Economy Action Plan of the EU and our international priorities. So we consider the resolution and the decision by the United Nations Environment Assembly as a key milestone in that regard, that we actually got the mandate to negotiate a new legally binding global agreement, and that the mandate also included a number of elements that the Intergovernmental Negotiating Committee should consider. Because an option at that time would obviously be to just say in a resolution, well, establish an Intergovernmental Negotiating Committee, and then decide later what that committee should discuss in terms of contents. But here we actually got a mandate with some clear guidance on addressing the entire plastic life cycle, looking into circular economy approaches, addressing sustainable consumption and production, financing mechanisms, scientific support, coordination. I mean, the many elements that the INCs should consider. So I think it was very important that the resolution was that comprehensive as it was, because it saved time, and time is key here. It has been mentioned by some previous interventions that yes, this came quite fast, but we should also have in mind that the issue of marine litter and plastic pollution has been on the agenda on UNEA for quite a few years, with a number of resolutions looking into that. And in addition, many countries have introduced different plastic policies, instruments, legislations over the past years. So yes, things have been moving quickly in terms of launching the negotiations, but at the same time, there is also a strong momentum because countries all over the world are considering this as a very important policy and one of the most important parts of the pollution crisis. In the EU, we're currently working also on the implementation of the EU plastic strategy, as well as the revision and development of certain plastic policies such as a directive on single-use plastics, which is banning some single-use plastic products, as well as introducing exempted producer responsibility and other efforts to address single-use plastics. We have a quite extensive packaging regulations and also for wastes, now implementing also more eco-design and circular economy policies related to products being put on the EU market. We have also in the pipeline quite comprehensive policies to address microplastics. But this can obviously not only happen in the EU, and we also depend in the EU on similar changes happening in the markets we rely on, and to address this pollution crisis in a comprehensive and useful way, we need to work together globally beyond the EU, because the EU cannot tackle this crisis alone. Although we have a number of policies that can address it, it's simply not sufficient to be able to tackle that crisis. And that's why we have said so clearly that the launch of negotiations for the new treaty is one of our key priorities on the global level. Yeah, so saying that business as usual, obviously not an option. I think our previous interveners have been very clearly expressing the various options and the scenarios that we may face if we do not act in a more comprehensive way. It is here important to remember that when we entered into the UNEA 5 discussions, there were actually more than 140 countries calling for a global agreement on plastics. You know, when we entered the negotiation table in Nairobi, more than 60 countries co-sponsored the resolution from Peru and Rwanda, which clearly expressed the strong momentum we had. And I think actually the time we had between the first part and the second part of the UNEA was very important in that regard, because we got to have the time to talk to a number of countries and discuss and also understand the different views of different regions. So coming into the second part of the UNEA with a better understanding of each other's views was a very important starting point for getting that successive outcome. For us, we were very supportive of the resolution that was proposed by Peru and Rwanda, and as I mentioned, the recruitment of more than 60 signatories to that was very important. And throughout the negotiation process, we were also very clear that this mandate should be comprehensive and ambitious, so that we save time when the negotiation process on the agreement actually starts. I have already been mentioning the basis for this in the EU, the Circular Economy Action Plan, which is a part of the European Green Deal, and the plastics strategy in the EU, all very closely interlinked, but a part of the green change and the green growth strategy in Europe. Looking now at the process we have ahead of us and the negotiations that will start next week, the first meeting of the Intergovernmental Negotiating Committee, I think we can expect a meeting where again, we will need time to listen to all different views, so that we leave INC1 with a very clear picture on where we are and what countries want on this agreement. From our side, we will be stressing the importance of looking, well, to say it differently, a key question here will be the life cycle, the plastic life cycle. Where does it start? Where does it end? The scope of the agreement will be very important in terms of what obligations the agreement may have in the future. Are we looking at such an early stage as the extraction of raw materials? Are we looking at the stage of polymerization? Are we looking at production? Or where in the plastic life cycle should this new instrument actually have some obligations. That will be a very important part of the first discussions. And also at least from our side, what will be the role of the circular economy in that regard? How can circular economy approaches such as product design requirements, minimum requirements for products being put on the market, rules for bioplastics, etc. Many of these elements that we have been reflecting on in the EU, how can they fit into a global instrument? And not least, how to address plastic production. I hear NGOs and others talk about production caps. Is that a way to go? And what kind of objectives are we then looking for in a new instrument? What can be suitable to set as an objective on a global level? Will it be an end date, ending plastic pollution by 2040, as the High Ambition Coalition is calling for? Or are we looking at something more general and not that specific? All these questions will need to be reflected on the first INC. And although we may not come with a very clear answer when we leave INC, we'll have a much clearer picture so that we can enter into the intersessional work between INC 1 and INC 2. INC 2 will take place in April, so there's not so much time. So we leave INC 1 with a clear picture and also with some ideas on how we can work intersessionally, hopefully to try to discuss more on the core obligations of the agreement, so that we can also spend time and deep dive into that when we come to the INC 2. I have also mentioned here the role of national action plans. For us, that's very important. National action plans can indeed support very much what is being set as key obligations in a global agreement. And we must also recognize the very importance of differences between regions, between countries, different needs, different challenges, both when it comes to finance and when it comes to pollution. So the role of the national action plans will also be a very important part of that discussion, and how that action plans can support what we set as objectives and obligations in the global agreements. We have also in mind that we have to conclude by 2024, which is of course ambitious, but we have also set 5 meetings of the Intergovernmental Negotiating Committee. We find it realistic. That's why also important position from the EU is to enter into substantive discussions as early as possible at the first meeting of the Intergovernmental Negotiating Committee. We are also very clear that all the other plastic-related initiatives, projects, regional and national policies need to continue in parallel, because we cannot wait for a global agreement to tackle it all. We need also these supporting local, national policies to continue. And also, of course, the very comprehensive and useful work of NGOs in that regard. But it's also very important that we see progress at each INC. We cannot leave one INC without having a very clear picture what is expecting of us on the next one, because we need to prepare for every session. In our view, using the first INC to get all views on the table, then diving into maybe core obligations and core provisions at the second INC, and then go more into the drafting process of the instrument later. But that also remains to be seen, because it's very dependent on the dynamics of the negotiation process. So although that is a picture I'm sharing with you now, we may also change that a little bit depending on the outcome of the INC. Because it's at this point, yeah.
We would like to keep some time for question, if you can.
Yeah, sure. Thank you. I was actually about to finish. That's
awesome. Thank you.
Quite good. That's, yes, thank you for that. Looking forward to receiving questions.
Good morning once again. I'm not going to dwell on the decision. I think the previous speakers mentioned UNEA 5.2, but some of the reflections from the South African side in terms of considerations, we had looked at, what could inform this life cycle approach, and we've seen that some of the submissions reflect the upstream nature in terms of at the very stage of extraction of fossil fuels that go into the manufacturing. And then, of course, some of the bio-based feedstocks, if they are there, recycled content. I think some of our EPR targets talks to recycled content. I think a very sensitive matter, especially for our plastics industries, on the reduction considerations that have been put forward, but we know that incentives are critical as well. Design and also responsible manufacturing have been indicated. Midstream also, because of the conversion, design and manufacture of the different products is still key. Also, we've reflected, and I think some of the speakers on in terms of phase out and the elimination, it's key to reflect on problematic and unnecessary products that already have been proven to have substitute alternatives that are affordable. I think one key principle that for South Africa and other developing countries, common but differentiated responsibilities, taking into consideration national circumstances. So those are key principles for us. If the online are there, okay, they're still there. Okay, we've got energy issues in South Africa. So I think one issue, extended producer responsibility, we've just started our mandatory schemes. It's early stages for mandatory, but some, because they have been voluntary, we are seeing progress. And of course, earlier on, we reflected on the additives that are key in the value chain, that we need to reflect on that. Labeling, I think we've reflected already on, the standards and the key significance that they would play, such that everybody knows what is in this products. Okay, the evidence becomes critical. So the plastic science, as we are reflecting today, it's something that also a key consideration at the global level, because everybody needs to be aware of the basis for some of the proposals, and that is something that we are taking into consideration. Risk assessment informs our considerations, and for us, especially at a downstream level, we have high unemployment rate as South Africa, and I think earlier on we reflected on the significance of the informal sector, especially in the plastic value chain. So it becomes key that we are able to protect those livelihoods, but also that doesn't mean that we take other considerations there. We have engaged as a region, African region, means all our 54 states, and there are key messages that came out of the September meeting in terms of what we wanting to put forward as the region. It's important to to note that the full life cycle approach is also what we are emphasizing, but we also noted that binding and voluntary approaches are still in there, and I think it's an important consideration, given that all of us are part of the developing countries. Elimination also key in terms of the combined strategy, because it's not a one size fits all, or we need to have that multi-pronged approach. Circularity standards, I think we've reflected on that earlier on. Environment management of waste, because we still have waste that is leaking into the environment, because some of our communities are not having a refuse collection. It's a key issue for us, and I think it's a priority for most African states. I think here I want to emphasize the voluntary approaches, given that we are not all at the same level, and some of the measures might be ambitious. That is an area that we would want the science and the evidence to also inform that area, such that we can effectively gauge the performance. Just to a snapshot, our consideration and the process involved stakeholders, multi-stakeholders, industry, the NGOs, and when I say industry, I'm including both formal and informal. And one of some of the key issues that they emphasized, the first one is the collection, like earlier on, and there was a reflection on the broken system to say collection, not everybody is receiving services, so it's one key area. Awareness, education, and training from also our national waste management strategy. Awareness is a key pillar, and it's something that also comes out in terms of managing plastic pollution, given the broad value chain. Circular economy, I think everyone touched on that, but also key to us is the infrastructure that we would need to be able to manage plastic pollution, and some of the technology, given the diversity of the plastic products. It's something that we need to look into, especially if we are introducing plant-based products, and how those are collected and sorted out in the value chain, because they can also create a challenge for some of the products that are petroleum based, and for the fitness for use, it's critical to ensure that that separation is there. The collaboration, multi-stakeholder action, I think it's not only at the global level, even for us, we've made sure that we try and everybody's on board. We might not always agree on the issues and how we solve them, but at least we are taking that process along. The funding and other means of supporting the implementation, it becomes critical. South Africa, we have introduced other measures at a national level, the EPR already. Even the informal sector is meant to get their share of the financing, aside from selling the recyclables. So what we are saying is that we need to be clear when we talk about means of implementation, because one size won't fit everyone. We started the National Action Plan, the master plan, which is in process, but it's something that as South Africa we've done. So some of these measures that are proposed at a global level, we are somewhere in terms of the implementation, but the means already we have found them from within. But on other measures that might be coming up, it will be critical that we are clear that we would need support for those given our national circumstances. So that will always be a key consideration for us. Compliance and enforcement, it becomes key, whether it's national or global level. We would want to make sure that there's clear direction with regard to what happens when the considerations or the obligations are not met. Setting of targets also at a national level, we do have specific targets linked to some of the measures, but when you take it to the global level, it would depend what we would want to put there. If it's just action plans everybody has, but whether they are getting us the results is something else. So we need to be clear what type of obligations we would want to see. Elimination, like I've mentioned, it's an area of a key focus in terms of what exactly would go into that and how we define those products that we would want to work on. Yes, there has been work that has been started by some of our stakeholders, but it was not necessarily inclusive. So I think going forward, it's a process that we can take nationally, and it would align to the elimination approach at a global level. Flexibility, voluntary approach, I think it's something that we appreciate. Research, it's something that we're working closely with the researchers to inform the policy direction that we are taking. Maybe just in conclusion, in terms of what we are emphasizing from our side is that we are still keeping the CBTR at the center based on our national circumstances. The plastic science research and development, we're keeping key. We know that not all our households are receiving, refuse collection, which is a very key issue in terms of us managing plastic pollution in the environment. We have close to 90,000 of informal waste pickers that are earning their livelihoods from plastic waste, and we would want to ensure that that also is not an area that is not given priority given the economic situation that we're having. We would want to keep the multi-stakeholder approach going forward and ensure that we work on the behavior change and also look into what incentives and disincentives we can introduce along the value chain and ensure that everybody meets their obligations. Thank you. I think from the DFFE side, we appreciate the session. I think we've had earlier engagements with the stakeholders, and some of the key themes that are coming out in terms of us having a multi-pronged combined strategy are key, and it's coming out. Designing for circularity, especially for plastics, given that it's a material that has been prioritized based on the pollution that we have identified. And the need, I think the last aspects that we've just reflected on in terms of the means of implementation, looking into currently what has been invested and us reflecting that it's not sufficient and we need to take that up. I think we would also want to keep those discussions going on. We don't want to leave this means of implementation to be reflected on last, especially for the ink process. We would want to make sure that from the very, first ink, there is some time that reflects on that. Of course, even with the means, we want everybody to be part. I think the reflection of public-private partnership, and already we've seen some of this in terms of the policy space that various governments have taken on. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Hi, everyone. I'm Katharina Giering from the African Circular Economy Network. Thanks so much for inviting us along. And thank you to all the speakers and the organizers to actually give us all this valuable insight and the information. It's a lot to digest and a lot to reflect on. Just for me to highlight, I think there's a lot of positive collaboration happening inter and intra-institutional, and we need to foster this collaboration further, especially between the key stakeholders like CSIR, the DFFE, CIRCULARITY, ACEN, ACEN, the Plastics Pact, the DSIR, so the main stakeholders. But we also need to do that on the African continent. I think there needs to be much more collaboration happening between the African countries, because we did talk about scale, that we need to create that kind of scale of economies, but we also need to transfer lessons learned, because in South Africa or Rwanda, we are quite far, but in other countries, we don't even have evidence, we don't even have data, so we don't even know what we're working with. So that's quite important. And we also need to make this really complex research digestible and understandable. So that aspect of scientific communication, I think, becomes very important for policy developers, but also for the people that have to implement those policies on the ground, like the municipality officers. So as ACEN, we are launching Circular South Africa during the World Circular Economy Forum, the South African studio, which will be fantastic. And we hope that that can also become a tool to actually help to reach those aims of using plastic as the valuable resource as it is, but also making sure that we close off the tap where it is necessary. Again, plastic goes beyond the packaging sector. We need to look at all the different sectors that we're having, especially in South Africa. The construction sector, the automotive sector is really important, so that we actually have systems and a coherent approach in place to tackle plastics. But even though we have all this information now already available, and yes, I agree, we do need more data, we need to have more life cycle sustainability assessments in place and other types of models, but we can already implement, and we need that implementation desperately on the ground, so that actually households are serviced, that we do have the landfills in place, that we do have the standards in place. So that's quite important. We did speak quite a bit of environmental impacts, but we also need to still consider the social and the economic side of things. So we do need to tackle unemployment, inequality, and just poverty on the ground, especially for Africa. Those would be my remarks. Thank you so much.
Before we do close the session this morning, it gives me great pleasure. You've heard the study presented this morning, the South African Pathways study that officially presented the results for South Africa. William made reference to the fact in his closing slide that the CSR has developed this capability and we're wanting to apply that in other countries. And so with the kind cooperation of the OECD, we agreed that we would use this event this morning to officially launch the CSR's report and also the Solve Plastics Africa initiative. So if I can ask, before I call Suzanne Ulofse from the CSR Hub, who was the project manager of that project, we have a video from Winnie Lau, who was our partner from the Pew Charitable Trusts in the USA, just to make some comments. Thank you.
Good afternoon. I'm Winnie Lau, Project Director of the Preventing Ocean Plastics Project from the Pew Charitable Trusts. In 2020, the Pew Charitable Trusts and partners released a groundbreaking report, Breaking the Plastic Wave, a comprehensive assessment of pathways towards stopping ocean plastic pollution. We found that there is a way for the world to cut 80% of the projected plastic going into the ocean by 2040. But it will require everyone, governments, the corporate sector, and private citizens to play their role. Recognizing that the model behind the global analysis could be adapted to help individual countries understand and tackle their plastic flows, we developed the Breaking the Plastic Wave Pathways tool, which empowers users to craft their roadmap and action plans tailored to their own circumstances. Together with the CSIR, we were delighted to have South Africa be the first country to apply the Pathways tool. With South Africa's recently implemented Extended Producer Responsibility Law, It was a perfect case study to demonstrate the utility and power of pathways, as well as to help us learn and improve the methodology and the model based on the CSIR team's experience. We now know that it is capable of establishing South Africa's baseline, evaluating how far extended producer responsibility schemes can contribute to reducing plastic pollution, charting a system-wide pathway that is sustainable for the environment, the economy, and people. It is also demonstrating the potential to inform South Africa's position in various international negotiations. We are grateful for the collaboration with the CSIR and South Africa, and are excited about the potential to further assist other countries using the Pathways tools under the Solve Plastics Africa initiative. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Yes, for me, it's then a pleasure to say that we were delighted that we were the first country that could work with Pew to finalize the model and test it. And I think the benefit of applying the model in the South African context was that it actually clearly showed to us, as William indicated this morning, that EPR can get us with 31% down from business as usual by 2040. But if we look at a systems change, then we can get as far as 63%. So that is the power of applying the Pathways tool, and therefore we are delighted to actually launch then the report. If I can just have my presentation up, please, so that I can also show to you where you can access the report. But I think what was also very key for us is that for the first time, we actually have an evidence-based strategy that we can put forward for South Africa. And this is really powerful because we've already shared the findings from this report with the department. And I think that also helps the national government in negotiating around the national treaty. So if we can just go to the next slide, let me just get this. So the report is currently available on the Waste Roadmap website. The full report is a 160-page report, but you only have to focus on the first 75 pages if you want the content. If you want the technical detail, then you can go into the annexures. But we've also developed a short 3-page briefing note with the key findings for the people who's less technically inclined and are just interested in what the main findings are. So this is where you can find the documents, and thanks to Linda and her assistants, we were able to upload it onto the website, so it is already active for access. And then just associated with the Pathways tool, the CSIR also launched today our Solve Plastics Africa Hub, which actually indicates that the CSIR has developed capability over the past number of years to not only model solutions and targets as with the Pathways tool, but also to model impacts. And there we can share with you that we've got capability in cost-benefit analysis. We've developed the SAS cost model in South Africa, which can also be applied in other countries, which will actually assist municipalities to work out the cost of implementing separation at source. Because we've realized also that if you want to convince a municipal council to introduce separation at source, they are asking you for the numbers. How much is it going to cost? So that is the purpose of the SAS cost model. And then we can also do scenario analysis, which will all help us then contribute to modeling and targets. And if you open the link to the pathway or to the Solve Plastics Africa hub, then you will find more detailed information as well. And just to also then indicate the modeling impacts that we have capability in is in normal environmental life cycle assessment, but also we are busy developing life cycle sustainability assessments by adding the more sustainable issues like the costing and the jobs and the socioeconomic impacts into the life cycle assessment. We've also got the capability for material flow and hotspot analysis, end-of-life modeling of materials, specifically looking at material pollution indicators, and we've applied that already for polystyrene containers, takeaway containers. And then last but not least, also economic evaluations. So our purpose of also launching this is specifically showcasing to our African partners, other countries, that we have this capability in Africa, and we would like to assist you to also get the evidence behind the negotiations going forward, but also developing strategies and policies of your own. So thank you very much. I hope that we will hear from African partners soon. Thanks very much.
And also just from my side, a big thank you to the Department of Science and Innovation who funded the study, to our thought partners, the Pew Charitable Trust and Oxford University, who placed their faith in our team to take this work forward, and then obviously our local partners, Plastic South Africa and the South African Plastics Pact. We wouldn't have been able to do this without all of the partners, so thank you. That brings us to the end of our workshop this morning. It's been an incredibly rich, I think my brain feels overwhelmed. We have recorded the session and we will make it available. I will share the link to that because I know I have to go back and re-listen to this a few times just to digest everything. And we'll be back to repeat again tomorrow with a really, really great lineup, an intense program again tomorrow morning. We broaden the scope. The focus today has been on plastics, but tomorrow we look at the circular economy a little bit more broadly. We look at the issue of trade and how that impacts or perhaps benefits the circular economy. And so I encourage you, those that are joining us virtually, we look forward to seeing you online tomorrow. I hope it's been a technology, what's the right word, without any hiccups for those that have joined us virtually. And it's been wonderful to have everyone in the room here today that's joined in person. So again, starting 9 o'clock promptly tomorrow morning for day 2 session for those who are joining us. Thank you very much.